the city of Brighton, a modern industrial hub, sat quietly along the banks of the Hudson River. Beneath its bustling facade, however, lay the undercurrents of injustice and prejudice. In recent years, Brighton had seen a surge in its diverse population. Immigrants, people of color, and marginalized communities came seeking opportunity, but discrimination and bias seeped into every corner of the city. At the Brighton Police Department, tension arose not just from the work but also from the relationships among colleagues. Ryan Miller, an officer with nearly 10 years of experience, epitomized rigid thinking. Raised in a family where his father, a police officer, instilled lessons about order and authority. These teachings, whether intentional or not, had deeply shaped Ryan's mindset, making him prone to distrust those he deemed different. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Sandra Johnson lived a completely different life. As the nation's Secretary of the Interior, Sandra was a model of resilience and intelligence. Born into a poor working-class family, she had risen through determination and talent. Yet societal prejudice never fully left her side. Seeking peace after long hours of demanding work, Sandra chose to keep her identity a secret while living in Brighton, craving anonymity and tranquility. That afternoon, Sandra stopped by a small grocery store on her way home. She wore a simple jacket and jeans, revealing nothing about her high-profile position. The store was located in the Central District, a neighborhood known for frequent minor conflicts between residents and the police. Ryan was patrolling nearby. His habit was to cast a suspicious eye over anyone entering small shops, especially if they were people of color. When Sandra exited the store with a bag in hand, his gaze fixed on her. A woman dressed simply coming from this area? Something doesn't feel right, he thought. "Excuse me, ma'am," Ryan called out. Approaching Sandra, she turned, her expression calm but tinged with surprise. "Yes, is there a problem?" Sandra asked, her tone polite but firm. "I need to check your bag. It's standard procedure," Ryan said, though his voice carried an unmistakable chill. Sandra frowned. "Are you suspecting me of something? You look suspicious," Ryan replied bluntly. Passers-by began to slow down, curious about the unfolding scene. Sandra took a deep breath. Trying to remain composed, she handed over her bag for inspection. Even though she knew she wasn't obligated to comply, Ryan rummaged through the bag, his cold eyes scanning its contents. There was nothing suspicious. He closed the bag but, instead of apologizing, threw Sandra a disdainful look. "Be more careful next time you're in this area," he said. Sandra stared at him for a moment but said nothing. She walked away, leaving Ryan standing there with a misplaced sense of victory. Just minutes later, a bystander uploaded a video of the incident to social media. The footage captured Ryan questioning and searching Sandra's bag in a disrespectful manner. Sandra's expression reflected her wounded dignity, while Ryan's demeanor exuded clear disdain. The video spread like wildfire across the internet. Hashtags such as #JusticeForSandra and #racial profiling began trending on various platforms. At the police station, Ryan was still oblivious to the gravity of the situation. One of his colleagues, a young officer named Emma, showed him the video. "Ryan, what do you think about this?" Emma asked, her tone pointed. Ryan shrugged. "Just another day on the job. I didn't do anything wrong." But the external pressure was mounting. Ryan was summoned by his superior, Lieutenant James Carter, a cautious and perceptive leader. "Ryan, this isn't good. You need to be more mindful of how you interact with the public," James said firmly. However, Ryan remained dismissive, failing to recognize that his career was hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, Sandra returned home and turned on the TV. The video of her encounter with Ryan was airing on the evening news. She saw Ryan's disdainful expression, heard the disrespectful words he had spoken, and felt a surge of anger. But Sandra was not the type to act on emotion. She sat down at her desk, picked up a pen, and began to write. She wrote an open letter to the people of Brighton, calling for calm and dialogue. The letter made no mention of her role as Secretary of the Interior. Instead, it focused on defending human rights and emphasizing the importance of justice. The next morning, Sandra's letter appeared on the front pages of major newspapers. Her words resonated not only with the public but also caught the attention of political leaders. Everyone was asking, who was the woman in the video, and how could she write with such authority and conviction? Ryan began to feel the pressure. On the streets, people stared at him, and whispers grew louder. A small protest formed outside the police station, demanding that he be held accountable. Yet, in Ryan's mind, the situation still felt distant and unreal. He couldn't believe that his career and life might change over what he saw as a routine action. But he was wrong. The next morning, the video of Ryan and Sandra became the talk of the city. In coffee shops, on buses, and even in offices, there was little else people discussed. Criticism of Ryan poured in, not only from social media but also from human rights organizations. On Twitter, the hashtag Justice for Sandra was trending at the top. At home, Ryan woke up and immediately sensed something was wrong. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages, calls from colleagues, and even unknown numbers. A message from Emma, his close colleague, made his stomach drop. "Ryan, you should brace yourself. This is bigger than you think." Turning on the TV, Ryan saw his face on the news. The anchor, in a sharp and critical tone, was condemning his actions, calling them a textbook example of abuse of power and racial profiling in law enforcement. Ryan felt his face flush with heat, but deep down, he still believed he had done nothing wrong. At the police station, Lieutenant James Carter summoned Ryan to his office. The desk was cluttered with files and reports. But what caught Ryan's attention was the grave expression on his superior's face. "Ryan, I don't need to tell you how serious this situation is," James began. "You're being suspended pending an investigation." "Suspended? For what? I was just doing my job," Ryan snapped, his voice filled with anger. "Your job isn't to erode the public's trust in the police force." James replied coldly, "We're not just investigating this incident. We're also under immense pressure from the public. Take a hard look at yourself." "Ryan." Ryan stormed out of the office, seething with anger. To him, this wasn't just unfair. It felt like betrayal from his own colleagues. But he didn't yet realize that this was only the beginning. In another part of the city, Sandra Johnson sat in front of her computer screen, reading through hundreds of emails and messages from strangers. Some expressed empathy. Others praised her composure in the video, but many were hateful, criticizing her for daring to stand against the police. Sandra was not someone easily shaken, but the messages made her reflect. She wondered if she could use this situation to bring about real change. She understood that the problem wasn't just with officers like Ryan but with a system steeped in decades of deep-rooted prejudice. That afternoon, Sandra received a call from the Prime Minister, an ally but also a cautious politician. "Sandra, I've seen how well you've handled this situation." His voice came through the phone. "But remember, every move you make will be scrutinized. Be careful." Sandra responded with her usual calm. "I understand, but I can't stay silent when so many people feel abandoned and unprotected." After the call, Sandra decided to participate in a televised interview. During the interview, she didn't mention her position but instead spoke about her personal experiences, the times she had faced discrimination because of her race and gender. "This isn't just my story," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is the story of millions who endure injustices every day that they do not deserve." The interview resonated with the public, garnering widespread sympathy. At the same time, however, it drew the attention of conservative politicians, who began to take a closer look at her. Ryan returned home in a state of turmoil. His small apartment in the Brighton suburbs was the same place he had lived since childhood. On the living room wall hung a photo of his father, a former police officer, standing proudly in his uniform. Ryan picked up the picture, recalling his father's words. Ryan, in this line of work, you can't afford to be weak. Suspicion will protect you from those with bad intentions. Those words had been Ryan's guiding principle throughout his career. But now he wondered if they were truly right. He thought back to his childhood, when his father would often tell stories about the troublemakers he had dealt with. Those stories had shaped Ryan's prejudiced view of people different from himself. That evening, Ryan received a call from his mother. She didn't scold him. Her voice was gentle as she asked, "Are you okay, Ryan? I'm worried about you." "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong," Ryan said, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "Are you sure? Sometimes you need to look at yourself before blaming others." She replied. Her words lingered in Ryan's mind, leaving him restless for the rest of the night. The pressure from the public continued to mount. Numerous human rights organizations sent letters demanding that the Secretary of the Interior address the incident publicly. Sandra knew she could no longer remain silent. She decided to hold a press conference at Brighton City Hall. When she stepped onto the podium, Sandra wasn't wearing the authoritative attire she was often seen in. Instead, she chose a simple suit, emphasizing that she was not just a politician but also an ordinary citizen. "A few days ago, I experienced something that millions of people endure every day," Sandra began. "But I am more fortunate than they are because I have a voice and power, and I will use them to fight for justice." Sandra's speech was met with thunderous applause from the audience, but it also ignited backlash from conservative factions within the government. Political commentators quickly dissected her address, calling it a declaration of war against the old system. Ryan watched the speech on the TV in his living room. For the first time, he learned that the woman he had disrespected was the Secretary of the Interior. Shame and guilt churned within him. "She's the Secretary?" Ryan muttered, unable to believe what he was seeing. He began to realize that his actions had not just affected an individual but had come to symbolize a much larger issue. But the question remained, did he have the courage to change? Ryan felt the weight of pressure bearing heavily on his shoulders. The scrutinizing gazes of his colleagues, the whispers from neighbors, and the uncomfortable silence from his family left him unable to escape his growing unease. Many nights passed without restful sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, Sandra's calm yet resolute face would appear. At the Brighton Police Department, things were no longer the same. The incident involving Ryan wasn't just a personal stain. It brought criticism upon the entire force. Lieutenant James Carter was forced to hold a press conference to reassure the public. He emphasized that an internal investigation was underway and promised that no misconduct would be swept under the rug. "Ryan, I need you to issue a public apology," James said bluntly during a private meeting with Ryan. "It's not just for your sake. It's for the entire department." "Apologize for what?" Ryan snapped, his voice full of frustration. "I followed protocol. She's not special just because she's the secretary." "No, she's not special because of her position," James replied, his tone sharp with meaning. "She's special because she's a human being you failed to treat with the respect she deserved." James's words left Ryan conflicted. For the first time, he began to question whether he truly understood the meaning of respect. Sandra didn't let criticism or political pressure deter her. Following her public speech, she decided to take action. She convened a group of human rights experts, community leaders, and representatives from law enforcement to discuss a plan for reform. The meeting was held in a large conference room in the government building. Sandra entered with a simple but commanding presence. In front of her were faces representing a wide range of interests and perspectives, from outspoken activists to conservative police officers. "We are not here to criticize each other," Sandra began. "We are here to find ways to reform an outdated system and create an environment that is safe and fair for everyone." Throughout the meeting, Sandra openly listened to all viewpoints, including harsh criticisms. A veteran officer, Captain Michael Grant, spoke up. "Madam Secretary, Our force works under immense pressure. We don't discriminate. We do what's necessary to keep the community safe. Sandra gave a gentle smile. I understand the challenges you face. But if a system makes a segment of the population feel unsafe, perhaps it's time to reevaluate that system. The meeting stretched late into the night. By the time it ended, some in the room began to see Sandra not just as a politician but as a true leader. A week later, Sandra and Ryan met for the first time at a public forum organized by the government. The venue was a large auditorium filled with hundreds of citizens, journalists, and representatives from various organizations who had gathered to listen. Despite being suspended, Ryan was asked to attend. Sitting in the front row, he felt uneasy under the constant glare of the cameras. Sandra, exuding confidence, stepped onto the stage. We cannot change the past, she began, her gaze sweeping across the audience. But we can change how we act in the present and the future. Ryan listened to every word, but a sense of suffocation gripped him. He knew the moment would come when he would have to speak, and it terrified him more than anything else. When it was his turn to address the audience, Ryan walked onto the stage amid murmurs from the crowd. He could feel every eye fixed on him. I know that what I did caused harm, he began, his voice wavering. I never thought of myself as someone who is racist, but the truth is, my actions reflected otherwise. Ryan paused, taking a deep breath. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to say that I will do everything I can to learn, to understand, and to become a better person. His words left the auditorium in silence. Sandra watched him, and in her eyes, there was no anger, only a quiet, thoughtful reflection. The public dialogue wasn't the end, but the beginning of Ryan's journey toward change. After the forum, he received an invitation from Sandra to attend a workshop on racial bias hosted by a nonprofit organization. Initially, Ryan hesitated. He had never thought he needed to learn about such things, but a part of him recognized this as an opportunity to make amends. The workshop took place at a community center. Ryan was one of the few police officers in attendance, which made him feel out of place. The facilitator, a well-known activist named Lisa Carter, began with a question. Who here believes they have no biases? No one raised their hand. Not even Ryan. Lisa smiled. Good. The first step toward change is recognizing that bias exists in all of us. Throughout the workshop, Ryan participated in various exercises. One activity required him to step into the shoes of someone who had experienced discrimination and describe how it felt. As he listened to the stories of other participants, he began to understand that their experiences weren't isolated incidents but part of a broader systemic injustice. By the end of the workshop, Ryan approached Lisa and Sandra, who had also attended. I was wrong, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know if I can ever make things right, but I want to try. Sandra placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering a kind smile. None of us are perfect, Ryan. What matters is that you're willing to change. Ryan began to feel the weight of his responsibility in driving change. After the workshop, he spent hours reading books, watching documentaries, and listening to stories from people who had experienced discrimination. These conversations were uncomfortable at times, but they helped him understand that change required not just willpower but a deep empathy for other circumstances. One morning, Ryan decided to return to the police station. Even though he was still suspended, he wanted to meet with Lieutenant James Carter to express his desire to participate in programs aimed at raising awareness about discrimination. James, I want to do something more meaningful, Ryan said. I don't want younger officers to make the same mistakes I did. James studied him for a long moment before nodding. Ryan, I hope your sincerity is genuine. If you're truly committed to change, I'll support you. With James's approval, Ryan began participating in internal training sessions at the police department. He shared his story, openly acknowledging the mistakes he had made, and encouraged his colleagues to reflect more deeply on how they viewed and treated the community. Some listened attentively, while others remained indifferent. But Ryan wasn't discouraged. He knew that meaningful change would take time. Meanwhile, Sandra faced increasingly significant obstacles in her reform efforts. Some conservative politicians accused her of using her personal incident to push a dangerous agenda. In the media, critical articles began to surface, labeling her as a system disruptor and someone undermining the police force. At a meeting with political leaders, Sandra found herself in a tense confrontation. A veteran senator, Richard Haynes, openly opposed her reform plans. "Secretary Johnson," he began, "do you believe that the reforms you're proposing will weaken the police force's ability to protect citizens?" Sandra remained calm and responded with a steady tone. "Senator, reforms are not about weakening the police force, they're about strengthening it. A fair and transparent system will help rebuild the public's trust in law enforcement, something we are gradually losing." Her response brought a moment of silence to the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others still looked skeptical. Sandra knew this was just the beginning of a long battle, but she remained unwavering in her resolve. However, tensions escalated suddenly when another incident occurred in Brighton. A police officer shot and killed an unarmed black teenager during a street confrontation. The event sparked outrage within the community, leading to massive protests throughout the city. Sandra immediately went to the scene to help calm the situation. She spoke with the victim's family, listening to their grief and anger. Standing before the crowd of protesters, she addressed them. "I understand your pain. I am a mother, a sister, and I know what it feels like to lose someone you love. But violence is not the answer. We need unity. We need dialogue to find a solution." Meanwhile, Ryan was also present at the protest. He witnessed the anger and frustration of the people. But this time, instead of avoiding it, he stepped into the crowd and listened. An older man pointed directly at him and shouted, "You people only know how to use guns and power to oppress us. Do you have any idea what my son went through?" Ryan didn't respond. He simply bowed his head. He realized that words weren't enough anymore. Only actions could make a difference. Recognizing the growing tension, Sandra decided to organize a peaceful march. She invited community leaders, nonprofit organizations, and even members of the police force to participate. Ryan, although no longer officially on duty, volunteered to join the marchers. On the day of the march, thousands of citizens gathered on Brighton's main streets, carrying banners calling for peace and justice. Sandra led the crowd, with Ryan walking beside her. His presence surprised some, but seeing the sincerity in his expression, their initial skepticism began to fade. During the march, Sandra spoke from a small stage set up in the central square. "Today, we march not just for those who have been wronged, but for a future where everyone is treated with respect and dignity." Ryan then stepped onto the stage. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I used to believe I had no biases, but my actions proved otherwise. I'm here today not to make excuses, but to say that I'm committed to doing better, and I hope all of us can strive for that." The square fell silent for a few seconds. Then applause erupted, a recognition of Ryan's courage. The march ended peacefully, but it marked the beginning of something much larger. Sandra, Ryan, and others began working together to build a comprehensive reform campaign, aiming to bring change not just to Brighton but across the nation. The peaceful march in Brighton didn't just remain a community event. It became the spark for a national movement. Media outlets covered it extensively, and social media platforms were flooded with images of the march, particularly the moment Sandra and Ryan stood together on stage. A powerful message was sent. Reform is necessary, and change begins with courageous individuals willing to confront their own mistakes. Shortly after the event, Sandra accelerated her police reform plan, focusing on 3 main objectives: training on awareness and unconscious bias. Police officers nationwide would be required to attend mandatory courses to better understand how bias impacts their decisions. Establishment of an independent oversight unit. A new agency would be created to investigate cases of excessive force or police misconduct. Strengthening community relations. Officers would be required to participate regularly in community activities to build trust and mutual understanding. At Congress, debates over the reform plan grew heated. Conservative politicians criticized it, arguing that it would weaken law enforcement's ability to do their jobs. Senator Richard Haynes, one of the plan's most vocal opponents, declared, "We are imposing overly strict regulations on the people who protect us. If we're not careful, we'll allow criminals to manipulate the system." Sandra remained resolute. In a speech during the congressional session, she asserted, "Fairness and transparency don't weaken law enforcement. On the contrary, they make it stronger. A trustworthy system is one that everyone can believe in." After weeks of intense debates, the reform bill passed with a majority vote. It was a major victory for Sandra and her supporters, but she knew it was just the beginning of a much larger journey. After the reform bill was passed, Ryan decided to leave the police force. He realized he needed to take a different path to truly atone for his mistakes and contribute to the community. He reached out to Sandra, expressing his desire to join programs focused on educating and training young police officers. "Ryan, you've done something very few people are brave enough to do. Admit your mistakes and work to change," Sandra said during a private conversation. "You'll play a vital role in helping others see the issues as you've come to see them." Ryan began his new role at a nonprofit organization dedicated to human rights education and awareness training for police officers. During the sessions, he openly shared his story, recounting the biases he had carried for years and the mistakes he had made. "No one is born perfect," Ryan said during one workshop, "but what matters is our willingness to learn and change. I used to be part of the problem, and now I want to be part of the solution." His words resonated with many attendees. A young officer named Liam, initially skeptical about the training sessions, approached Ryan after class. "Officer Miller, I used to think all of this was just political nonsense," Liam admitted. "But after hearing your story, I've realized I need to change how I see things too." "Thank you," Ryan smiled, feeling that he had finally found real purpose in his work. Despite her many accomplishments, Sandra continued to face challenges. Some conservative regions in the country resisted implementing reforms, while segments of the population remained distrustful of the government. Sandra knew that achieving real change required building bridges between opposing sides. One day, Sandra invited Ryan to join her on a trip to a small town where reform faced the strongest resistance. This town was home to people like Ryan once was conservative, rigid, and holding deep-seated biases. During a meeting with the local community, Ryan stood before the crowd, his nervousness evident. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "I used to think like many of you. I thought that any criticism of the police was an attack on our honor. But the truth is, I was wrong. And I'm here today to say that change isn't a threat. It's an opportunity for us to do better." Sandra followed, sharing her vision of a fair system where everyone, regardless of race or status, could feel safe. The meeting ended on a conciliatory note. An elderly woman approached Sandra, gripping her hand tightly. "Thank you, Secretary Johnson. I don't agree with everything you said, but I can feel your sincerity." A year after the events in Brighton, the city had undergone significant changes. The reforms were implemented earnestly, and the public's trust in the police force was gradually restored. Sandra, though still facing challenges, felt proud of having laid the foundation for a better system. Ryan continued his work in education, becoming a source of inspiration for hundreds of young officers. He frequently collaborated with Sandra on community projects, and their relationship evolved into a meaningful friendship. At a ceremony marking the one-year anniversary of the reforms in Brighton, Sandra addressed thousands of attendees. "Change is never easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But if we have the courage to confront our mistakes and work together to correct them, then nothing is impossible." Ryan stood in the crowd, quietly observing. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something greater than himself, a feeling he had never experienced during his earlier career. The story of Sandra and Ryan is not just a tale of justice and reform. It's a story of courage, forgiveness, and the human capacity for change. And from this, a hopeful future unfolded, not just for Brighton but for an entire nation.